So we are now in record. Um,
Okay,
I
got it.
I believe this is your third novel overall and your fifth book in total. Is that right? And I
That
also
is
saw that two
correct.
of your
Yep.
books are short story collections. So I
Yep.
wanted to ask you like a kind of crafty question as a person who has written some short stories, but I feel like trying to turn one of those stories into a novel is like an impossible ordeal. What do you get from both forms? Like, what do you get from a short story that you don't get from a novel and vice versa?
Yeah, they're so different, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they work so differently as a reader, and they are functionally just completely different to write because the time frame is not, it has nothing in common. I I I think I started out when I was in college, I wrote poetry, and I when I
Everyone's
started
gateway.
writing prose, yeah, so that's what I felt like writing short fiction was already so much longer than a poem. I'm like, I was writing this much, and then all of a sudden I was supposed to fill up 15 pages, and it felt like an infinite number of words. How was I ever going to do that? So then the idea of a novel was like absolutely impossible. So
Right,
I felt
right.
like I was a short story writer who was going to at some point have to learn to write novels because that's what the world wanted. But
I was told
I,
when I was in the MFA program that you can't sell short stories. You have to write novels. So I was like,
yeah.
I don't want to.
I mean, it is true that that's like that isn't, it's not a fact, and there are definitely story collections that are beloved and readers of short fiction, but it is definitely harder to sell a standalone book of stories than it is to sell a novel. So, yeah. But I feel like I have learned to really love the novel form too, that it's I can live with it for such a long time.
Hmm.
I have to embrace the living with it and not just be like, oh, this is going to take me forever and I'm going to be like slaving away at this for a million years. But the feeling that it's sort of like living a second life that for somewhere between 3 to 5 years of kind of solid work, this story and these characters will be wound into my life, and I will be thinking about them while I'm driving my kids to school and making dinner and, sweeping the floor and all the things that life requires. I also get to live this second fictional life in a
Hmm.
continuous and really deep way. And that's cool. That's really special. And I feel like instead of it being just like this project is going to take me forever to get from page one to page whatever and, revised over and over, it's more like I get to live with this, and I get to become more closer and closer to it over all these years. And then, yeah, it's like I have more life.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I get it. I don't know if I'm cut out for it, but I get it.
I know,
That's really
I
cool.
know. I don't think I was necessarily naturally cut out for it, but I forced myself into it. I still
Yeah,
love writing short stories, though. I have a practice that where I write one short story every season. It has nothing to do with the season. It's just a good time marker.
sure.
It's like in 3 months, I can definitely finish one story, and I can do it in one weekend if I need to, or I can, work on it over time.
Hmm.
And it sort of keeps me, that's 4 stories in a year and 12 stories in 3 years, which is kind of a book, right? So it
Yeah,
feels like I'm like
absolutely.
kind of like quietly and secretly writing this second manuscript too, and getting to hang out with weird ideas that I definitely don't want
And if it
to live
turns
with
out not
forever.
to work, you don't have as much invested. You can move on to the next one without feeling like you're abandoning this big project.
Exactly. And I can try something weirder too that's like riskier and like just like, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but it's fine. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
cool. What are, I guess, thinking about this specific book, The Last Animal, and for those who are just joining us on Zoom or who might be watching this later on YouTube, I'm talking with Ramona Ausubel about The Last Animal, her recent novel. I'm Matthew. I'm the club coordinator for the Natural History Society of Maryland. We're all things Mammoth right now, so if you, for some reason, you don't know yet that we are in the process of putting together a mammoth, and we're going to be revealing it to the public on February 4th. Check out our website, marylandnature.org. So we got mammoths on the brain, and Ramona also had mammoths on the brain. Can you say a little bit about where you came up with the idea to write about this? Like, what was the spark that led to this book?
Yeah. So it all sort of converged in a moment when I had a new baby and I was lying, she was asleep on my chest, and she was this tiny little, brand new animal that had never existed before on the planet. And she fell asleep. So I was time to get some work done. That's what you have to do. You're supposed to sleep when the baby sleeps, but that's a lie. You have to get work done when the baby sleeps. So I popped open my laptop, and this story appeared about scientists working to de-extinct the woolly mammoth. And I just had this rush of feeling like we are, we don't know how to take care of the things we already have. And we have to try the most complicated, the hardest, most expensive version of saving something. We just only do those things. That's our species. And it felt like both so much hubris and so sort of ridiculous, but also a little bit hopeful. Like, what if we did bring some things back? We've made a lot of deletions as a species, and it's possible for us to use our big fancy human brains to bring something that existed, or a thing similar to something that existed, back. Maybe that's good. So it just felt like there was enough in there. It was complicated enough that I thought, I think there's probably a novel in there. But I did not start writing that novel right away. It was a few years, but it kind of clunked around in my brain as that combination of the beauty and the hope, and also the devastation that is implied in extinction in general. And the question of what would I bring back if I could bring something back? What would it feel like to ask that question? What would it feel like as a species for us to be reintroducing things that either we have erased or have been erased by no fault of our own? Yeah, so that was kind of the origin. And then I started, when I was ready to start really writing the book, I did a lot of research on CRISPR and de-extinction and all of the rewilding projects. And this is, I mean, it's really real. This is for sure happening. And it's not in a super futuristic timescale at all. Probably in the foreseeable future, there will be a gene edited woolly mammoth like creature walking somewhere on this earth, and along with all kinds of other animals that, like dodos and other things that have been extinct for a long time. But also scientists are using CRISPR to create some more diversity in the gene pool for animals that are not extinct but are struggling. So if they had, if there was more variety in the gene pool, maybe some animals that are still alive would have a better shot at staying alive a lot longer.
Yeah. I have some more questions too, but I want to kind of take a little time for you to read from the book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And then I'm sure that the folks who are here probably also have some questions as well. I know I can see the description of the novel that's up on our website, but maybe it would help for you to tell us a little bit about how you would describe this book. What should we be prepared for here before you give us
Yeah,
read the
so
excerpt?
here's our little book, my little baby mammoth friend. So the novel is, I'm going to start at the beginning when I read, so you'll kind of get a sense of it from that. But it's about a family, a mother and her two teenage daughters. The mother works in a paleo lab on a CRISPR project, mammoth related, but she is a postdoc. She was married young and had children young, and followed her husband's career for a long time and didn't do her own work. So she's dived into this a little bit later and feels a little bit out of step and a little bit old. And her husband has died a year before. So the trio of women is in the thick of grief and sort of a reconstruction of their family. And the girls are now, when the book opens, they're 13 and 15. And they're in that part where they're sort of waking up to the way the world works and finding a lot of faults with it, and feeling not great about how their mother is being treated by her male colleagues and boss, and more comfortable being uncomfortable than she is. So they are willing to point things out that they don't like and to sort of make trouble, where she is of the generation that's kind of more looking for a side door rather than breaking the front door down. So it's a lot of sort of stuff about that kind of tension, in addition to the backdrop of the Mammoth Project and everything that implies. So
Perfect.
I'm going to read the very first page, and then I'm going to skip a little bit and read one other scene. So it's just a few minutes. 1. In the age of extinction, two tag-along daughters traveled to the edge of the world with their mother to search the frozen earth for the bones of woolly mammoths. Eve was 15, reshaping herself more each day. Vera, just shy of 13, was a stubborn, straight line. Jane, their mother, was a graduate student in paleobiology. Their father had died 1 year before, plunged into a shock green mountain in a tiny car on a tiny road in Italy where he was doing research for an article. Now they were three. Girls, sad and angry and growing and trying. Mom, sad and angry and trying. Hauling their bodies across the scoop of sky to get to a bare place, a lost place where ancient beasts had once roamed. Somehow, they hoped, this trip would be the beginning of a new road, gentler, ascending. Okay, so they take 1 million flights to get to Siberia. It's like days of travel, very uncomfortable. They're staying in this place that is based on a real place called Pleistocene Park in Siberia, where when we do recreate these woolly mammoths, the idea is to release them here. So part of the justification for rewilding is that we needed to have megafauna in the Arctic. They were always designed to be there. They are integral to the whole system, and without them, everything is out of step. So the woolly mammoths would have knocked down all the trees. They tromp and pad their huge, heavy bodies across the snow, packing the ice down and creating kind of a thick insulating blanket to keep the permafrost frozen. So without them now, we don't have that sort of thick layer of ice. We also don't have a good layer of grass. So in addition to in the wintertime, they pack the ice down and then they fertilize and are spreading seeds everywhere and pooping to fertilize it. So that in the springtime, then the grasses grow back and there's this thick grass layer. So all throughout the year between the ice and the grass, there's a sort of cozy blanket that's keeping the permafrost cold. Without that, the permafrost is melting, releasing tons of CO2 into the atmosphere and speeding up the whole process that we know we need to get out of.
One of my questions was if you remove the trees, how is that supposed to help with climate change? But you say that you put grass there instead, and that actually makes more
exactly,
sense.
yeah. So the idea is that there's not really supposed to be a lot of tree cover, and there isn't a lot. There's just not enough. There's not enough sort of nutrients for like big foresty trees, and it's really just too cold for real forests. In a lot of that tundra, not in the there's
You just got those little
forested
tiny
parts.
stunted trees like you get in
Exactly.
the
So it's
far north.
stunted little trees, kind of scrappy little things that don't do anything to keep things cold, basically. Yeah. So they have arrived in this place and the girls they're bored and they're tired of sitting in this little cabin. So they head off for a walk down the beach. And they just sort of come to this little cliff. Eve kicked and hit something hard. Shit, she said. She hopped and said, my toe bones are actually pulsing. Vera, meanwhile, dug at the hard spot. It was not rock, not wood, bone, some ancient grass eater that had drowned, starved, been eaten. The two of them dug at it with sticks because wasn't that why they had come to this distant edge? The person I would like to drown is Todd. He's the postdoc on the excursion, Eve said, in his zipper pants. Vera did not want to admit that she had a crush on Todd, the first plausible crush. She said, totally, and nicked at the sand with her stick. What emerged was not bone. It was fleshy almost, like leather, and had a few coarse hairs. What exactly is this? Eve asked. Something dead. Everything here is something dead. This was different, though. This was not another piece of decayed skeleton. They knew protocol would be to go get the adults and set up proper extraction practices. They might do damage to a valuable specimen, but it was sure to be nothing, another juvenile discovery brushed aside by those in the know. I feel like digging, Vera said. So they dug. Eve dug in one direction and Vera dug in the other, and the thing was long and as thick as a small tree trunk. It had pores and skin, and it had fur. Vera came to a curve and followed the shape downward until she found the end where there was an opening. It's a trunk, she said. It's a trunk, Evie. They dug faster, both on Eve's side, hoping the trunk was attached to a body, a whole mammoth frozen upright in this spot. If there's a body, we should get help, Eve said. But when the trunk ended more quickly than they expected, and the body attached was small, and they realized that it was a frozen baby, it felt like a rescue mission more than a discovery, and they did not stop, but dug until their fingers were soaked and frozen. It was perfect. It was sad and beautiful and perfect, the size of a large dog. Pull, Eve said, and they reached their arms around the back, Vera on the front end and Eve on the rear, and they hugged it, this cold body, and they pulled hard, bracing against the cliffside until it came free with a sucking sound, and both girls fell backward. The mammoth smelled of the beginnings of rot. It was starting to thaw. Vera pushed it off herself and stood. She was elated and disgusted, and there was a rampage in her chest. Is this happening? She asked. It looked like the animal might at any time open its big eyes. Eve nodded. She brushed her hand over the mammoth's little tail. What now? Vera asked, looking at the whole thing, the trunk a sea, the breathing hole in the shape of a heart at the end, tufts of almost blonde hair all around. Eve, eyes closed and lashes thick. We should have gotten help, Eve said. I'll stop there.
All of the reviews that I've seen, which are basically like 100% positive, are pointing out just how finely drawn the relationship is between these girls and their mother, and also the fact that although this is like a serious topic and could even be sort of overwhelming in if treated in a way, but you're bringing humor and a kind of lightheartedness to everything that really helps the heaviness of the theme and the grief that you're plowing through really go down a little easier. And I can hear that in the selection that you just read. And I think I mean, books like this are necessary because it helps us to process these heavy feelings. And um, can you say something about the connection or the parallel that you're making between the grief of a personal loss and that of like the extinction of a species? You do seem to be connecting those two ideas.
Yeah, I think that's part of what I really wanted to write toward is the way that it can feel so abstract to live in this moment of extinction that I mean, it's going to be drawn out and it won't happen all at once, but we're living with a lot of loss on a scale that is, at least for me, really hard to hold on to, but also impossible to not constantly carry around with me. That it feels like it's so present, but but I can't, like my little brain is not capable of really managing it. And at the same time, we're losing really specific and really personal things in ways that I think we have a hard time expressing out loud. So there's this sort of combination of like these big shared losses that we all have in common and we all understand at some level what's going on. So it's public, but harder to really process privately. And then there are these private losses that are hard to express more outwardly. And that sort of finding the meeting place between those two spheres of the sort of heart felt really interesting and really necessary to me just as a person. Like how do I live with all of this, with everything that might happen, with everything that is happening, with these very specific small personal losses and the enormous things that we all share.
That's a lot. Let me see if I can hear something from some of the folks who are joining us on Zoom. And maybe you could say a little bit about what you'd like to ask Ramona about, your experience with the book, anything that you'd like to talk about here. Because I've been kind of
Thanks you all for
monopolizing the
coming. It's really nice
conversation.
to see you out
Yeah,
there.
yeah, thank you, everybody. So this is questions from the audience. And I'm going to stop for talking for a sec.
Are we supposed to not like give any spoilers in case people are watching the video on YouTube? Like, are we supposed to like,
If
like,
there's a spoiler coming, they can quickly hit pause.
okay, I have like spoiler alert questions.
Right, go for it.
Um, um, first of all, like your sentences I found really crazy. And awesome. Like I would be like, is that a sentence? And then of course, sure, it's fine. It's great. I loved it. I love that. I loved how Vera understood why she bakes. Like she had that knowledge. Like today, I just feel like making buttercream. I just want to whip, like I really like that because I'm like, learning how to get in touch with, that kind of stuff now. And I thought that was really interesting. The questions I have, well, I wanted to say the most shocking part was like Eve's self insemination. I was like, what? Excuse me. I couldn't believe she did that. The questions I have are, is Helen really evil? And is the Iceman baby possible? Like, or is it true that that it was just like scraps of code?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I agree. I was also shocked by that. I was like, wait, really? We're gonna, okay. Okay. So the Iceman is also based, he's a real guy. He lives in his, perpetual frozenness in northern Italy. And I went to that museum a few years ago, and I just knew that there was going to have to be some kind of interaction between these two stories. I still hadn't quite figured out what the novel shape would look like, but I was like, that Otzi guy, he's got to be part of this. And then I started reading about him, and when they found him, he got all these letters from women all over the world that said, if you discover that there is sperm in there, I would like to offer to have that baby. And I was like, wow, I would never have thought of that. And that is outstanding. Another example of like humans. We really know how to go for it. So I sort of like that lodged back in my mind as something that was, I think at the time I wondered, maybe I'll write a short story about that because that feels like more like a short story realm. But then once there was actually the sort of material of this guy, I thought, no, maybe. So the answer is no, it is not, it's not possible. It's been like, there's so much degradation in there of between like temperature and weather and fungi and all the other things. There is no viable sperm left. So it would not have worked, and Eve need not have worried. But I liked the idea of that and the way that it like kind of creepily intersected with her dad's work. And it was like lots of things that felt like they were like surprising and strange. Yes. So what was the other question?
Is Helen evil?
Oh, is
or
Helen actually
was she
evil?
telling
Yeah.
the truth? Yeah.
I don't think so. I think that she is a extremely wealthy person who has been wealthy enough to have a lot of agency beyond what normal people have, and has been able to kind of make her imaginary world come true for a long time, so that there's a danger to that kind of power that our desires lead us to all kinds of things. Even good people who have the ability to act on all of their desires do things that are not generally good for the rest of us. So I think that is in play, but I think she's telling the truth, that she's not the one who wanted to sell the baby. Yeah.
Awesome. I did have one
Yeah.
other follow-up question. You said that they had like the professor kept calling her, and they discovered that the mammoth baby that they found was actually a lot younger than what they thought. Is that a true statement? Is that
Yeah.
true?
Yeah. So they've found these much more recent babies that have, and they're like 5,000 years extinct, which is, I mean, at least I did like a long time ago, think of like dinosaurs and mammoths as being kind of contiguous, but they're not at all. Like their mammoths are right in our little zone, just a tiny little fingernail's breadth away from us. And we were alive on the planet at the same time as mammoths, where we helped to kill them off because they were nice and meaty, and we ate them mostly. But we also, I got really interested in the sort of the co-evolution of humans and elephants and mammoths. Elephants created the savannas in Africa, basically. Like they did the things that I was saying that the mammoths did. They knocked down all the trees. They basically made the savanna, and they made it possible for us to basically stand up on two legs and head off and hunt and do all the things that early humans did. And we followed them up into Europe. So there's all these beautiful cave paintings in southern France of mammoths, and we used like the sort of rib cage of the mammoth as an early kind of architecture. There's all this cool stuff, and I think that I just love that, the way that the two stories are kind of wound together and how closely related we were, which I think is part of why it's so compelling to bring them back. It feels like maybe some like long lost memory of that time. Like we just want that. I don't know. Yeah, sort of a side note, but thanks, Tammy.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
How about some other questions?
I would like to ask you sort of a variation of the process question that you probably get every time you talk to people. I was wondering, how you approach a story first, and then how, as you're kind of going through, you sort of discover what the story is really about, and then actually decide that this is working.
It's such a, I also always want to ask that question. And I'm always happy when somebody else asks it of other authors, because I feel like it's fascinating every time. I'm glad you asked, Josh. Thanks. So I have learned that my process is really requires a kind of a long, early nonsense stage where I am not writing in a book-shaped form yet. I'm like, it's like the primordial slush phase. I'm writing the material and the like possibility of life, and it doesn't look orderly or clear, and no one could read it and have any idea what I was going to be doing later. It's like just like this like mushy material making stage. So I basically am just following my instincts and my nose and my interests. So whatever it is, whether that's like investigating characters, just sort of like following somebody around and being like, show me your life. Where do you live? Where's your house like? What's that weird picture on your wall? And what's the like scariest thing that ever happened to you? And what makes you like laugh so that you snort milk out of your nose? And I just like sort of starting to just pay attention to what feels compelling and alive in this place. And I'm following the questions that like those places where like things are rubbing up against each other and either not making sense or seeming to sort of dovetail in surprising ways, looking for surprises. And that draft, I'd like, in a perfect world, I like to write that draft pretty quickly so that I am also kind of making use of the non-logical part of my brain and just like going with it without anybody's like sort of like the little creatures that pop up on my shoulder that are like, sorry, this is not making any sense. What are we doing here? I'm like, we don't have time for you right now. We have to write 10 pages today and you are not part of those 10 pages. So sit down, my friend. Yeah, so like my first novel I wrote in like 5.5 weeks, the first draft. I wrote 10 pages a day, double spaced, on the weekdays. And at the end of that, I was like, okay, I kind of understand what I care about in this project. It didn't make any sense. And there were characters that appeared suddenly on page 75, and I did not go back and explain where they came from. I didn't care where they came from. They just were there now. And there were other characters who I realized were not going to be interesting or part of it, and I just ceased to write them. They just didn't exist anymore. So the second novel I didn't have, I had a kid, so it was a little slower. So it was like more like, I think like probably 10 weeks or so that one happened in that first draft. And this one I had a little even less time because then I had 2 kids and a job. So it was really like slim pickings on the hours in the day. But I wrote, instead of the full 250 page first draft, I aimed for this idea that I thought of as the half draft. So not the first half or the second half, but the kind of foundation half. So it had, every part of it had the DNA of the whole, or the possibility of the DNA of the whole in it. But I was aiming for like 100 pages or so, but beginning, middle, and an end. And I wrote that over a couple of months. So in those cases, I'm just like, I'm in that part, I'm in that discovery phase. And then I take a little break and then I read it back and I make note of the things that feel like, oh, I'm noticing this and I'm noticing that. this is exciting and cool. I'd completely forgotten about that scene. I'm interested in figuring out where that goes. And then the second draft, especially with that half draft version, is really writing into it. So adding the scenes that feel like they're connecting, exploring the possibilities of things that are just beginning to emerge, all those sorts of, so it's like I've got the sort of like trunk is like things are sprouting out, and then I'm just going to like keep following all those branches. And then I stop again, and I read it back again. And then I'm starts to be sort of more fine tuning, and things get pruned away and cut and all of that. But it feels like it's the process is like explosion of life, and then it takes a shape. And then once it has that kind of shape, then I'm like switch back into my logic brain. I still think of revision as really creative, and I'm like fully open to making big changes, to killing off a character, adding a character, consolidating characters, whatever the things are that the book needs, changing the point of view, any of that can happen right up until the end. Nothing is ever set. Every part is a moving part all the way until it's truly finished. But still, once it has that shape, it becomes as much kind of an engineering and construction project as it is a creation project. And I love that part. That's the part of the other reason that I write that first draft so quickly is because that part terrifies me. I'm like, how am I going to make something out of nothing? That is very, very scary. I'm not sure that I'm capable of it. Every time, like I'm starting on my fourth novel, I still feel that way. So I need to kind of get through it before I can stop myself. And then after that, once I have something, like, oh, okay, let's get to work. I'm really excited to, bend and break and move and shift. And that doesn't feel scary at all anymore. And it just feels like play kind of, and work, but a lot of play.
Where does the research come into play during that process? The science in this book is all like super cutting edge and everything. So I'm curious how you find time to do that while you're being creative and playing with things.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in this book, I did a lot of research before I started. So I probably spent, I don't know, 3 weeks or something just reading and watching lots of YouTube videos and start just getting a sense of, like, I had the very most rudimentary understanding of CRISPR when I started. And I knew I needed to know a lot more because I wanted it to be possible. I didn't and still do not care if it's super plausible. Like it's not going to happen the way it happens in the book, for sure. But I want it to be possible. So I had to have enough of an understanding of that before I began so that I could like bend the story in that direction. But then once I did, I put all of that down and I wrote the story paying the most amount of attention to the sort of plausibility and possibility of the emotional truth. So it needed to be emotionally absolutely right. As a novelist, that's really my most important job, especially because I write literary fiction instead of science fiction. So, I read Jurassic Park at the beginning of writing this, of course, because I felt like, well, kind of weird. There's a book, I think. There's a book that deals with this. And that book, I was shocked to see how long the passage is that explains everything. There's like many chapters of just explanation, like, no, I swear it's possible. Here's how we do it. Here's how the lab looks. Here's how, like, it is so explainy. And I'm like, that is not my project at all. That's cool for you, Mr. Crichton, but I'm not going to be doing that because that's not what I'm really writing. I'm really writing about what it feels like to be in a project like this, what it feels like to be in a moment of possibility like this. So I spent once I had, it was like abandoned, like set the research aside, make sure that I'm sort of writing with that as like in the back of my mind as a plausible possibility, but really looking for the true story of these people's lives. And then in draft 2, it was sort of like, okay, so now revisit, where am I? Where has the emotional story gone and how far has it drifted from the research and how much do I need to like pull one toward the other in some way? So it was kind of a lot of that, of like weaving the boat, sort of steering the boat back in the direction of reality and then allowing stretching a little bit when I needed to. But I think of research as kind of being medicinal. It's just enough to teach the body how to take care of itself. But if for me, I find that if I do too much research, it begins to take over and it overwhelms the part of me that knows how to write the story, because it's that sort of like that character on the shoulder again that's like, that is not how it's going to work. You have to change it. You have to change it. It's not going to be like that. I'm like, thank you. You are not helpful for this story, so you have to go away. So I have to be careful not to, I don't stop and do research as I'm trying to write that early draft. I'm really letting that like be true and on its own terms.
It's funny you brought up Jurassic Park. There's at least one review that I think you yourself shared where it compared your book to Jurassic Park. How do you feel about that comparison?
I mean, I'm happy that it's good. Like, people have heard of Jurassic Park. So anytime your book gets compared to something that everybody's like, oh, right, yeah, that thing. It was called, one of the early reviews called it a feminist Jurassic Park. And I thought, that's cool. I take that. But I also, yeah, I feel like the thing that's fun about Jurassic Park is that it's fun. My main association was with the movie, which is what I saw when I was a kid. I didn't read the book until later. But I like the kind of experiment, the big what if of like, well, could we do this? And what would it be like to be on that island? And I did kind of want to play with that same sort of big what if energy that's just pleasurable and interesting and is like, yeah, I want to go. I want to go on the journey. Let's do this.
Some more questions from folks in the audience, maybe? Would you like to read a little bit more, Ramona?
Sure, let's see. Maybe I'll just keep going from that
Sure.
spot. Hold on.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hold on, let me
I
find
totally
it.
agree with what you were saying about Michael Crichton too, because it's such a fine line between like, here's like a dozen pages of like hard science, and you're like, whatever, but also you don't want it to be just sort of hand wavy, like, just trust me. You have to get that balance right, and that's never easy.
I know, I know. Well, I think that for me as a reader, I'm willing to I'm like, no, I believe you. It's fine. We extract the blood from the mosquito and amber. Sounds cool. Great. Moving
Just
on.
go with it. Yeah.
Let's get to the dinosaur island. But I think for real science fiction readers, the actual like moment by moment, like, yes, it's real, and I want you to convince me that it's really, really real. There's a real satisfaction in that for people who read differently than I do. So I'm all for that, but I'm not going to be that. I mean, who knows? Never say never, but I think that's just not the writer that I am
Sure.
either. Though one of the things I had to figure out in this book is how to get the information in so that the reader understands how CRISPR works and how that Mammoth Project will work. I want you with me. I don't want it to just be like, don't worry about it, trust me, it's possible. But I also didn't want that like 50 pages of exposition. So so the other thing that's important to know in my process thinking is that the first chapter is the last thing I figure out. I might start with a version of a first chapter, I usually do, and then write forward from there. But I will never get everything that needs to go into the first chapter when I'm starting to write it, because I, of course, have no idea what's coming next. So I worked for weeks before this was when I was turning in the final draft on that first chapter to make sure that all of the things are there. I'm seeding stuff about the father and the grief over his loss, about the mom and her early sort of non-career as she followed her husband around, and her newly sort of born career, and the pressure she's under to financially support and emotionally support this entire family now. I'm seeding all the stuff about Siberia and Berkeley, where they live, and the sexism in her lab, and all that stuff has to be present in the first chapter so that it can then grow up into all the other parts of the story. And I had to figure out a way to get the information about the project in without it being like, sit down on the velvet sofa while I explain something to you. So I ended up using the sort of the mansplainy dudes to do it. I'm like, oh, you guys have to do it. You're gonna sit. Everybody in this situation actually fully knows what's going on, but you're going to say it out loud because that's the kind of guy you are. So it was actually perfect. And they
That's
did me a
brilliant.
big favor by being available to mansplain the whole thing to the women who already know what's going on. So that was good. But I only gave them like about a page and a half to do it. So it was they had to be pretty quick. Okay, so let's see. All right, so they've got this baby mammoth now. It was heavy and cold, their clothes soaked through. It softened noticeably. They would be in trouble for not getting help, and they would be praised for the find, and they did not know which would win out. I feel like it needs to be refrozen, Vera said, and they walked faster. As they walked, Eve said, once upon a time, there were two sisters, but they were not enough for their mother who wanted a giant mythical beast. The girls bravely traveled to the edge of the world while their mother searched in vain for the animal which was both real and made up. Eve paused to catch her breath. One day, Vera said, the brave daughters were exploring by the sea when out of the cliff's edge they saw what their mother had always dreamed of. It wasn't huge because it was a baby, but when the girls went to it and dug it out, it started to stir. They sang to it and it woke, groggy from having been asleep so long. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythm of their footfalls on the beach, scrape of rock and wet sand. Vera said, but in the fairy tale, it always gets darker before good wins out at the last minute, and the children are often the only ones to survive. Vera pictured the scene from Jane's perspective. Mother on the cliffside with a happy hour bottle of vodka, beginning to worry about her daughters who had been gone all afternoon. The sky faintly pink, though the sun would never set. Mosquitoes starting to come out. And up the beach, two girls emerge, to their mother's instant relief, and the girls are carrying something, and that something is a perfect baby woolly mammoth.
Thank you. Awesome. I guess one other theme that we haven't explicitly talked about now, and you just mentioned it, is this the constant barrage of sexism from all of the men, both seen and unseen in the story. And you write a lot about the sexism in science and in academia, and I trust that a lot of that comes from your own experience. But how was there some research in there too? Like, did you interview women scientists about what they had gone through, and did that find its way into the book at all?
Yeah, I did. I didn't do any interviews, but I did read a lot. And I read a lot about women in academia in general. And I read a lot. There was a lot of sort of whole moment, one of the moments on Twitter, of sort of the like lab girls who are being sidelined in many ways. So I followed a lot of those threads and stories for a long time. And even though I don't work in STEM, I work in an English department, and my chair is a woman, and I feel like the department is as good as they come, basically, in academia. It's still a system that is built on a patriarchal plan. And my grandfather was a professor at Columbia. My grandparents had known each other since the fifth grade. They were both lived in Jewish immigrants living in tenements in Brooklyn. And my grandfather was very, very smart. Both of them were very, very smart, but he was the boy. So after he came back from the army, he went into the PhD program at Columbia and was hired upon graduation, and had taught Victorian history at Columbia his whole career. And my grandmother was a key part of that system. She was the faculty wife, and she was just as smart as he was. And she proofread lots of people's dissertations and helped them with their books, but she did not get her name on anything. And she was the person who hosted all of the parties for all the colleagues and all the students. And she made everything nice and lovely and easy so that people could have serious conversations and so that people could relax. And when I got a job as a professor, I was like, oh, I need a faculty wife. Like this is really hard to do the whole thing. I need to have somebody who's gonna, at the end of the semester, invite all the graduate students over and, make the hors d'oeuvres so that I can read their papers at the end. But I have to do all of those roles. And it feels like even though I work in a department that is very supportive and where the half of us are women, it still feels like the system is built to make that hard. And being my kids, I started my job when my kids were not super, super tiny. So they were not like in nursery school anymore. And I think that made it a lot easier. But I have a really close colleague who's got kids who are just turning 2 and 4, and it's really hard. They're sick all the time. And, it's really hard to be in this world and to be able to be taken seriously and get tenure and all those things that we are, whatever the job, ladder looks like in different spheres. It feels like it's the cards are stacked against a person, even if she doesn't have a shitty, horrible boss like Jane does. But I wanted to it's definitely amplified for her because it needs to be it's the sort of spring that she ends up bouncing off of in order to make these subsequent complicated decisions that she makes with the mammoth embryo. So if the work situation had been softer and gentler and quieter, she might not have felt so justified in stealing the embryos and leaving and taking them to Lake Como to follow this woman Helen and her elephant. So it felt like it was core that I kind of turn up the volume on that pretty high so that the whole story launches the way that it needs to.
Well, it felt very real. I kept kind of like, oh, I know these people. Oh, I'm so sorry. So,
Yeah.
what's next for you, in terms of the writing life, or what are you concocting for your next performance?
Well, I've got I've got a new novel thing. It's definitely in the primordial slush phase. I don't know at all what shape it's going to take. I have a bunch of little sort of like little bits and pieces. I taught a novel writing class last spring, and I wrote along with my students. So I had them write 500 words a day. We slowed it down a little because, they take a bunch of different classes and I wasn't going to make them do my crazy thing. But they wrote 500 words a day during the week, and I followed along with them. We read this really wonderful craft book called Refuse to be Done by Matt Bell. It's about novel writing.
I know
It's
Matt. Yeah,
short.
he's cool.
Yeah, he's cool. And it's really excellent. It's really practical. So we read that book, and one of his pieces of advice that I think is really, really smart is in that first draft is write the islands. So don't try to write a continuous narrative arc. You're just finding those little islands of interest. We're going to follow this character here. We're going to see what's up with that tunnel she's digging in her yard. We're going to climb the tree and look up at the neighborhood and see what's going on elsewhere. So I did that. I was writing the islands. And now that's what I have. So I just looked at it the other day. I read everything through last week, and I'm like, all right, let's see what this is going to turn into, but I really don't know yet. So we'll see. I will follow that. And then I'm doing this thing of writing a short story every season. So I've got probably about halfway, maybe a little bit more toward that maybe eventual collection. And then I'm also working on a craft book about getting unstuck. So I've been paying a lot of attention as I've been teaching and writing myself for the last 12 or 15 years to how very often I'm stuck or has some version of have sort of come to the end of my knowledge or understanding of something. And how that has to be in a way that's like a useful, necessary pause of okay, I've come to the end of my knowledge or understanding of something. And instead of being like, oh no, I'm stuck, this is bad, it feels like also an opportunity to take a breath, take stock of what I do know and what I'm interested in, and then sort of reset and take another step using that sort of new wave of energy rather than trying to just keep banging on the same door over and over. But I want to do this in a very practical way. So the book is 101 sort of exercises to move through different phases of feeling stuck. So I'm working away on that, and we'll see what happens. So I've got lots of things. And then, of course, teaching and reading theses and writing letters of recommendation. And I've got kids and a dog and all of the wonderful, magical things of life.
I'd like to ask one more question if I could.
Yeah, of course.
As you were revising the book, getting it ready for the final form, was there something that was really hard for you that you felt like this character isn't working or this scene isn't working and it was you had to let it go and it was a really hard thing to do, and what was that like?
That, yeah. Well, so this is the thing that's sort of crazy about this book is that for a lot of drafts, there were two major differences from the final version. One is that we went into everybody's head. So it was really a multiple point of view novel. It was never first person, it was always third person, but it was balanced between Jane, Eve, and Vera. And this is the other crazy thing is that Sal, their dad, was alive for many drafts. So he was part of this family, and he was kind of a shadow though, because I was never really interested in him as a person himself. So he was just like sort of like the almost like a carbon copy or like the like opposite version of Jane, and he kind of just followed her around.
It was the
And he was
faculty
not
wife.
very interesting. Yeah, he was like, meh, who cares about that guy? But I didn't really know what to do about it for a long time, so I just let him be that. And then there was sort of this feeling of like one that I needed to land in Vera's perspective, that she was the character who had the most to lose. She's the youngest. She's the one who's gonna, the younger you are at this on this planet at this moment, and this takes place a little in the future, but not too far into the future, the more stake you have in the shifting climate. So I felt like Vera has the most stake in that way. And she's also the one who's the most on the outside of the family. Eve remembers their dad a little bit better than she does because she was alive with him for longer. And Vera just needed to be the person who was kind of holding the cards for us, even though she knows a lot about everybody else and we learn a lot about them. She had to be the main person. So I shifted it toward her. And then I also just had this really clear sort of understanding that I think I subconsciously knew for a really long time, but wasn't ready to admit because it was going to require a lot of work, that Sal's job was to be an absence, that it was not about him, but it was about the sort of space that he had left, partly out of because of his death and because of the grief that then grew up around him or his loss, but also because of that sort of the question of how do you as a woman circle a man for a really long time, following his work, caring for his life, raising your children together, and then to sort of like fall into that void when he's no longer there propping everything up. So once I knew it really clearly, and it took hardly any time at all. It was kind of like almost like my subconscious had been writing the book that way the whole time. And it took me like, I think it was like a couple of weeks where all I did was be like, oh no, yeah, Sal's not there. And it is about him not being there. And he just like poofed out of it. And in his place, the whole story came together. It was like, oh, that's what it always was. It's always been about loss and grief in that way. And the specificity of that, like we were talking about at the very beginning, the specificity of that exact personal loss was so core to understanding the big abstract hugeness of the collective loss.
And that does take the conversation full circle, doesn't it? Thank you, Ramona. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So last call for questions. It's almost 8, so we should probably wrap this up, unless there's something on your minds. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ramona Ausubel, so much for taking the time to speak with us. That was really interesting. The book, of course, is The Last Animal, for those who, again, are watching this on YouTube, maybe. Is there any parting words that you'd like to share with us? Anything else we should know that I didn't bring up?
No, I'm just so excited for your mammoth. I can't wait.
I know,
I'll
right?
be following very
It'd be
closely.
awesome. It's all
Yeah.
hands on deck right now. We already pushed back the deadline once, so it's going to be
Okay.
awesome. I've seen it happening. It is real. It does exist. It's not
So
science fiction.
cool.
So
I
hopefully y'all
have to
can
come
come and
visit.
check it out. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I will
100%.
definitely come. That I'm going to put that, yeah, down in my life wish list.
Nice. All right. Thank you so much, Ramona. I appreciate you and all of you as well. Happy holidays. Happy New Year, everybody.
So
Take
nice to
care.
see you all. Thank you for coming.